Want to know on three? 1, 2, 3.
Want to know?
Get it. Welcome, hola, and bonjour. You're listening to the official 1-0 Fantasy Football Podcast. It's time to join your host, the commissioner extraordinaire, the fantasy football trademonger, Owen Odog Drake.
Welcome to another edition of 1-0 Fantasy Football, where you are the 1 and I'm the O. Today, we're going to talk about the week that was week 2 of the NFL season. A week that kicked off with your boy Odog deep in the Kawartha Provincial Park of Ontario. I think that's the name. And seeing reports of the narrow victory of the Chiefs over the Chargers from the bush when I got a little bit of service as Mike Williams came back from the dead. The Chiefs receiving core gave us more of the same. And Justin Herbert was hammered, dragging himself to the finish as these two titans of the quarterback position and Herbert and Patrick Mahomes went toe-to-toe on Thursday night. And so pivoting from football for a second, and we're going to try another episode with minimal editing because that was really lovely. And, you know, after the camping trip, 4 days, racking up the kilometers of travel with the canoe, either, paddling or carrying it, was a challenging trip, but also an easy one in terms of what we've taken on in the past through these backcountry camping trips. But the highlight of the effort was your boy Odog dragging one of the other people in the canoe. Shout out to my main man Ivan on this one, but sitting in a canoe, we're just dragging it through a swamp. On that last day, it was just pouring in Kawartha, and I had just about enough. Wanted to get back and watch some football, and I wish I had a picture. Ivan. I mean, shout out to you, but I wish you would have taken a picture of me dragging this canoe through the swamp. But again, pouring rain, didn't want to have the phones out. And that was about an hour to get through that swamp. And then we flew through the rest of the trip all the way back to our entry site, or to the entrance to the park where we came in, the launch site. So, after dragging the canoe and the slog through the wavy Anstruther Lake up in the Kawarthas, Owen was a zombie on Sunday and Monday, and that kind of matched the Colts vibes. We'll get to that in a second. And this overall just kind of explains the late-ish pod that's coming your way, but I'm back to 100% today, and the show plows on. There's not going to be as many delays going forward because that was the camping trip of the year. One thing that made me laugh before the weekend was this news report from Adam Schefter on Facebook. 8 former kickers, Nick Folk, Chase McLaughlin, he's the Colts kicker now, so I got to get the pronunciation right there. Randy Bullock, Matt Amendola from that KC game on Thursday night, Brett Maher, Cairo Santos, Eddie Pinheiro, and Jason Myers, they would be kicking over the weekend for other teams, including New York's current kicker, Greg the Leg Zuerlein. This was over 25% of the week's kickers who would be kicking or have kicked for the Jets. Pretty crazy. One thing that was amazing to see, second overall pick and hometown boy Aiden Hutchinson, star of Hard Knocks this year and soon to be, if not already, the leader of this defense that's kind of a work in progress in Detroit, led the Detroit Lions on Sunday against the Commanders with 5 solo tackles and 3 sacks. Got his first sack of his career in the regular season, so attaboy Hutch. Gotta love that. And if you haven't seen the clip of Aiden Hutchinson singing Michael Jackson, I believe it was Billie Jean, you're definitely going to want to search that up. Another funny thing that had me laughing so hard last night, I saw this tweet from Matt DeSorbo on Twitter, and he said, quote, "Start your running back 1 in the flex. That way, when your opponent is reading down your lineup, they get a jolt of fear." Jonathan Taylor in the flex? This team is so deep. I'm doomed. Then you've already won. And he quoted this as Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Now, I don't think Sun Tzu had a direct quote for Jonathan Taylor in there, but I absolutely love this tweet. It was a work of art. Lastly, in the funny things to highlight here, if y'all play in individual defensive player leagues, I randomly stumbled upon this. Lorenzo Carter of the Atlanta Falcons on NFL.com fantasy. He currently had 308 points for week 2. A bit of a glitch in the system, but if you wanted to beat somebody with only one person in your lineup, then Lorenzo Carter was this guy for you this weekend. Oh, still laughing here. I think they had him with like 51 return touchdowns or something for the reason. And I would imagine this would be rectified sometime soon, but I'm quickly bringing it up on the old NFL fantasy app to see, is he still sitting at 300 points? So, I mean, stay tuned. We're going to look at the stats here for week 2. And they have rectified it. That's too bad. So if you were sitting there with 308 points from your linebacker, I thought the starting percentages for Lorenzo was 0%, but you could have had 300 points for a moment there. So before we get going here today, a reminder to like and follow the show on the socials. Check out 1-0 Fantasy Football on Facebook and Instagram as at 1-0 Fantasy Football. That's ONEANDO Fantasy Football. On Twitter as 1-0 Fantasy. That's ONEANDO Fantasy. And on YouTube as 1-0 Fantasy Football. Tomorrow on the socials, we will have our signed Gabriel Davis jersey giveaway draw. We've had over 530 likes on the Instagram ad, hundreds on the actual Facebook ad, and 20 additional entries on the image post as well. A few people commenting their locations to get that bonus entry. So stay tuned into the podcast for the draw happening on tomorrow's show, which will also preview the Thursday night football game, Steelers versus Browns this week, half of the matchups, and will include the quarterback river, where Owen gives his quarterback stream recommendations of the week. Very necessary with the state of the quarterbacks in fantasy football. So with that being said, let's get into the stories of the weekend and we'll find out why that quarterback position is in a bit of flux, let's say.
Stories of the weekend.
All right, so we're going to jump into some stories from the football weekend that was week 2. And if I can have your attention for one moment, I'd like to start with my Colts and tell the tale of the 0-1-1 start. The Colts. Where does one even begin? Did I see this coming? Yes and no, and that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but what I do know is that the Colts always start slow and that they always struggle versus the AFC South. This is similar to like in the AFC North where the Browns, Bengals, Ravens, and Steelers, they always have these weird outcomes and close games with unexpected finishes. Or in the AFC East with the Dolphins, Patriots, Bills, and Jets. Maybe a little bit different this year with the Bills just kind of annihilating everyone. But these teams in the division, they simply know each other way too well. And we can go back to last season's dumpster fire loss to the Jaguars, moving back to the Colts, that is, in week 18 that led to them. It was brought up like a billion times on the broadcast because it just kind of happened again. And, we can, and the previous seasons, we can see the slow starts from the Colts and the in-division struggles, but this is now at a new level. I'm going to start at special teams because it's kind of the easiest, but losing Rigoberto Sanchez at punter, that was rough. You lose a Pro Bowl level starter anywhere. A torn Achilles for Rigoberto. He was replaced with Matt Haag, who kind of sounds like a throat-clearing loogie, but whatever. I mean, he's had a ton of action punting. He hasn't been the same level as Rodrigo, but it hasn't been, I don't know, it's fine. And then Rodrigo Blankenship, we mentioned on the previous podcast, he self-destructs after he won the job in Indy handedly in camp to be the kicker. He's cut after the implosion of week 1 and becomes the scapegoat of the tie the Colts had against the Texans, who through 2 weeks, the Texans, that is, they look to have a not so low-key feisty defense. So we're fresh off their week 2 game where they held Russell Wilson and the struggling Broncos offense under Nathaniel Hackett to 16 points. So more to come on them soon. But back to the Colts. This week, they lost 24-0 to the Jacksonville Jaguars. The back-to-back first overall selecting Jacksonville Jaguars, where they haven't won in years, despite being the Colts, despite being the stronger organization and team. And okay, let's start with Matt Ryan. He was not impressive, but we found out Michael Pittman, he injured his quad in practice Wednesday of this week, and then that was followed by Alec Pierce. Reports came out that this rookie second-round receiver, he began experiencing concussion symptoms from that week 1 helmet-to-helmet hit that I called attention to by a Texans defensive back, Petrie. Very dirty hit. So both top options were out for this game, leading to a receiving core led by the one and only Paris Campbell, who, of course, like when we actually need to rely on him, he absolutely goose-egged. And this guy and Ashton Doolin, Mike Strahan, which, they're solid wide receiver 4-5s, but the Colts, and they made errors like crazy in this game. They dropped balls. They didn't run the correct routes and just looking so out of sync with Ryan. And this completely shut down the passing game. The Jags focus on Jonathan Taylor in the running game. And where at the half, I believe they just kept repeating the stat to the point where I just started tuning out the broadcast. 5 carries for 5 yards or something like that. And that was the offense. And then this loaded defense, it was brutal too. It was continually gashed by James Robinson and Christian Kirk. More to come on James Robinson and Christian Kirk later, and Evan Ingram as well, as they made themselves look great, and the Colts defense surely helped them. Don't call me Shirley. Sorry, something that Kate and I do. It's something that the Colts defense surely helped them with. And I guess if you hear Shirley on the podcast, I want to hear y'all yelling back. I can't hear you, obviously, but don't call me Shirley. Kind of a fun thing that Kate and I do. Join in, shall we? We'll talk about that on the Ramp to Champ podcast. But anyways, back to the Colts. So I heard some analysis of the new Gus Bradley defensive scheme for the Colts. And where the scheme has struggled in the past, notably with the Raiders last year, it needs its stars in order to function. It's like a Jenga tower where, like, if one piece is missing between, you got Stephon Gilmore and Kenny Moore at cornerback, Forrest Buckner at defensive tackle, and Shaq Leonard, the whole thing just falls apart. And we've been missing Shaq for the first 2 weeks of the season, and this can easily be seen. So for fantasy, you're going to look for the Colts to take some major steps forward on both offense and defense coming soon, especially with, the return of Shaquille Leonard coming soon. But the losses of Nick Sirianni to the Eagles head coaching position last offseason, Matt Eberflus to the Bears this offseason, like I mentioned, Shaquille Leonard, Colts defense is not a start until Leonard's return. And next week, you got a matchup with the Kansas City Chiefs, who should absolutely manhandle the Colts. So really, really pumped for that. Stay tuned to the spiraling that is definitely going to occur from your boy Odog on Twitter. So let's move on to something more fun. Joe Flacco and the Jets, baby, with a 99.9% win probability after Nick Chubb's third rushing touchdown on Sunday. The Browns were looking to move to 2-0 and had the announcers talking about how long it's been since the Browns have been 2-0 to open a season. Nope, not for long though, because you got Joe Flacco. The former Raven has over 100 passing attempts in the first 2 weeks. And you can contrast that with Justin Fields, who has 28 at the lowest level, He staged the improbable comeback of all improbable comebacks, that's Joe Flacco, to lead the Jets to a 31-30 victory over the Browns. Lots of tweets about this too, but had Nick Chubb not scored his third touchdown and he had the Browns just taken a knee, this game was a guaranteed win for the Browns. But he ran it in to put the Browns up 13, which, should have been game over with like roughly 2 minutes. But you had a 66-yard touchdown to Corey Davis. that made it a 6-point game with 30 seconds of game time remaining, an onside kick recovery, a Garrett Wilson 15-yard touchdown, more to come on him later, and a Jacoby Brissett desperation interception that gave the Jets the victory. Pure insanity. So let's move on to some injuries that popped up pregame Sunday. The Buccaneers and the Saints game. This was wild for a number of reasons. So first, we had the news of Alvin Kamara's rib injury before the Sunday games, which caused him to be inactive, which was signaled by the Saints signing Latavius Murray to the practice squad during the week. Something that I discussed on the previous pod as an indicator. You got to follow these transactions, even if it's just to the practice squad. They get elevated come game time, and then there's an inactive, and then you have a zero burger on your bench. So keep that in mind. Then, minutes before kickoff for this game, we got a sleeper alert that Jameis Winston was playing in the game with 4 fractures in his back. Oh, Jameis Winston warrior mode. So the Saints would end up losing, but they lost to Tom Brady, who had to make use of a team without Julio Jones, Chris Godwin, and then Mike Evans, who was kicked out of the game for like his 3rd fight over the years with Marshawn Lattimore, cornerback of the Saints, who always shuts down Evans, who got into it with Brady. And because these things always start with defending the quarterback, and then all of a sudden Marshawn Lattimore and Mike Evans are out of the game. Absolute insanity there with the Bucs and the Saints. And okay, now we're going to get into it more in a moment in the big thrill section, but how about these Miami Dolphins, baby? They took on the Baltimore Ravens, who seem to have a secondary we can target for fantasy points again. So mark that down in your brains. And we had team records all around for the Fins. Tua passed for 460 yards and 6 touchdowns. Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, 11 receptions each for over 170 yards each and 2 touchdowns each. So we're seeing that the ceiling for these Dolphins is a lot higher than we originally thought. One note here with the Dolphins, though, Tua Tagovailoa is going to be a hot waiver pickup of the week that I'm just going to discuss later. But if you're following 1-0 Fantasy Football on the socials, my dad had a tough weekend. That, if you listen to the podcast, you get all the information. He had a tough weekend with the Tua situation. So I shared on the podcast, I believe, that my dad had dropped Aaron Rodgers in my league of record to pick up Tua Tagovailoa. Not sure if he listened to the podcast or rethought, the matchup against the Ravens defense, because Sunday morning before kickoff, he dropped Tua, who would score over 45 points in our scoring format, to pick up and start Matt Ryan, who scored negative 4.2 points in our scoring format, representing a 50-point drop and causing a loss for the week. So check out a photo of that transaction on the socials and share your Sunday lineup or just week 2 lineup nightmare if you so please. Speaking of high ceilings, love what I'm seeing for fantasy out of the Lions. They got out to a 22-0 first half lead over Carson Wentz and the Commanders, fueled by DeAndre Swift averaging 11 yards per carry. Amon-Ra St. Brown's dominance for them at the receiver position. We'll get into him in the big thrills. And Jared Goff, 4 passing touchdowns against a Washington defense that can be taken advantage of for fantasy football. One small story here. We all piled on to shoveling dirt onto Jalen Ramsey's grave after getting burned by Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs and the Bills last week. But Ramsey got his revenge with a game-sealing interception to move the Rams to 1-1 on the season with a victory over the Falcons. Good to see there. Now, let's move on to a crazy game with a ton of storylines. Kyler Murray and the Cardinals. They took on the Las Vegas Raiders, and I want to start here by establishing the context. So without DeAndre Hopkins, this Cardinals offense has looked like it's in trouble. Similar to last week, the Cardinals were down by over 2 touchdowns at the half, this time 20 points, and fantasy football managers were panicking for Kyler. I got a front row seat to that with Kate. Owen, why does Kyler have no points? Hey, Kate, remember last week, same thing. But so not to worry, though, Kyler managed to put up 277 yards, passing touchdown, and 28 yards on the ground, including a score as the Cardinals went into overtime on this one. The big storylines of this game are mostly from overtime. But before we get to that, if you haven't seen the 2-point conversion play from Kyler, you need to. He traveled over 84 yards in this one play, according to the NFL on Twitter, which is only technically a 2-yard play. Over 80 yards of travel for Kyler, 20.8 seconds. This was madness. And this was one of the plays that got the Cardinals into overtime, where Kate and I watched live, and the Cardinals defense, they called game. The Raiders were driving and looking likely to at least get a field goal out of their first drive, but there was back-to-back fumbles by Raiders wide receiver Hunter Renfrow, the last of which left him concussed as he got obliterated. And the Cardinals took the fumble to the house for a game-sealing defensive score. After the score, to add to the storylines, Kyler Murray was slapped by a fan, which police are investigating. Just absolute craziness in this game. And if that wasn't crazy enough, consider the Denver Broncos offense, who in their home opener struggled with the clock so much, taking false start penalties, that the fans were counting down the playing clock in the stands because the offense just couldn't handle it. I mean, I have fun, as many do, with like Russell Wilson and kind of the cheesiness or the fakeness, I guess, but this seems to be a play calling issue for me, from my perspective, as first-year head coach Nathaniel Hackett. He needs to give Russell Wilson more time from play call to snap to make adjustments and be like the $250 million man that they hired. Along with this, per Benjamin Albright, the Broncos coaching staff, they're all new to their positions, and we're seeing this as the offense and the Broncos in general struggle out of the gate. Recall, I was talking about, I'm worried about this Nathaniel Hackett switch this offseason. And we talked about Adam Gase. Adam Gase got his coaching opportunities after coaching Peyton Manning's offense. Now you have Hackett fresh off coaching the Aaron Rodgers offense. So, I mean, hopefully this turns around, but like at this point, I doubt it can get much worse. And following the Broncos 16-9 wins over the Texans, Nathaniel Hackett told reporters, quote, "I would be booing myself too." So good to hear, but let's see some changes here, Hackett. 2 weeks, 2 frustrating games for the Broncos. Come on, man. The Cowboys with Cooper Rush, a victory over, they took down the Super Bowl participant and definitely Super Bowl hungover Bengals. The Bengals head coach Zach Taylor not showing any creativity. Joe Burrow holding on to the ball too long. He's on pace for over 100 sacks behind the, in quotes, upgraded offensive line. The Cowboys defense led by sophomore sensation Micah Parsons with 2 sacks. Big part of the reason why the final score ended at 20-17 Cowboys over Bengals. Cooper Rush, better than expected, supporting both Noah Brown and CeeDee Lamb to solid finishes. These Cowboys, they ain't out of it yet. Second last story here. It's back to Jimmy Garoppolo time in San Francisco, which is great for fantasy, but Trey Lance, season-ending ankle injury in this one. And it's really worst case for Lance, as Garoppolo, he wasn't traded, and he gets another chance to take this playoff-ready team back to the playoffs. They're loaded on defense. They're loaded on offense. And this is as I mentioned, this is a switch that's much better for fantasy. So gone are the 10 plus rushing attempts from Lance per game, and back are more rushing attempts for current starter Jeff Wilson Jr. at running back, more rushes and targets for Deebo Samuel, a more solid floor for Brandon Ayuk potentially, and George Kittle, who, if he plays, upgrades across the board. So see if you can target these players in trades. For Lance, this is absolutely devastating. Like I mentioned, it's a similar story to Dak Prescott, who had the massive ankle injury a couple years ago, and he still talks about it bothering him from time to time in his interviews. But where you have Dak, he rushes occasionally. This is a massive deal for like the rushing inclinations of Trey Lance. We've talked about that a lot going into the season. So happy recovery, Trey Lance. But hey, wheels up for 49ers for fantasy. Let's go. Lastly, the news wouldn't be complete before moving back to a more funnier and positive place. So let's start off with the positive place, celebrating the rookie wide receiver class of 2022. Massive weeks from Garrett Wilson, Drake London, Jahan Dotson, Chris Olave, where Wilson and London, they finished in the top 12 of the week. So more to come on them later. And then on the funny side, the Bills absolutely smacked the Tennessee Titans so bad. And I mean, as a Colts fan, yes, I'm definitely selling this inside, especially with the Colts being just smacked too. So Titans fans, though, don't feel too bad. Like, they smacked the defending world champs last week also. And, but this week, the Bills smacked the Titans so bad that there were headlines by about halfway through the third quarter last night. These were the headlines. Case Keenum is now in for Josh Allen. Followed by the next one, Derrick Henry. He's also got his gloves off on the sideline. Tennessee's waving the white flag, and we're still here in the third quarter in Buffalo. Rough night for Titans fans that they'd like to soon forget, so I'm going to move on.
The official Want to Know Fantasy Football News.
So the big news of the weekend, in my opinion, for fantasy, it was the Lance injury. We've already discussed the implications, upgrades across the board for 49ers weapons, Wilson Jr., Debo, Ayuk, Kittle. Should he be healthy enough to play football again soon? So let's dive into some other news and hoping for the best for Trey Lance. Okay, so from the Thursday night game, Justin Herbert, per Good Morning Football, I believe, Herbert had more tests on his ribs and chest after the punishment that the Chiefs inflicted on him. Stay up to date on those practice reports. I don't expect him to miss time at this point, but keep an eye out for the Chargers adding another quarterback to the practice squad. Similar to, just like I said, the signs for Alvin Kamara last week. Head coach Brandon Staley said that there is a fracture in the rib cartilage for Herbert. Consider him day-to-day, which may suggest he's going to be good to go for this weekend. Speaking of Alvin Kamara, he missed a lot of practice last week with the ribs injury we reported on earlier. He was inactive for Sunday's game against the Bucs. It's at least a semi-confident expectation that he's out there this week with some pain-killing shots and maybe a flak jacket or a pad over those ribs. Najee Harris off the week one injury scare. He was full go in the Steelers Sunday game. More to come on him later on. Chris Godwin, hamstring injury from week one. He was ruled out for the weekend along with Julio Jones. So we're going to dig into the Bucs wide receiver core here for a second. Look for Godwin to be out at least another week or two. Mike Evans, he was suspended, as I mentioned, he was in the fight, kicked out of the game, and now is suspended for a 1 week for the fight with Lattimore due to the history of their fights. So now we're going to have a Bucs offense that's without Godwin, without Evans, and potentially again without Julio Jones, who was also out with a knee injury. They could all be out this week, where the Bucs, in recent news now, they've signed Cole Beasley to their practice squad, and they're going to elevate him to the active roster this week in this barren wide receiver corps. So get a replacement for Brady potentially this weekend. We're going to get to Brady in the roadkill section soon. They're going against the Packers this weekend. And for Godwin, Evans, obviously you're not starting either one of those. And I think you can start Julio if he plays as that really risky injury-prone start, and Beasley as a hero start with being signed maybe, and Russell Gage is essentially the last man standing. But what a headache this wide receiver core is now. J.K. Dobbins, he was questionable heading into Sunday as he continues to work back from the devastating knee injury of last year. He was inactive again this past week. So with how this has progressed and the severity of the injury, I'd be recommending keeping JK on your benches for this week, even if he starts, and that applies to next week. So just bench him for that first start, see how he acclimates. And you can see just from the Ravens running backs, if you don't have a full health of J.K. Dobbins on his first start, even with them being cautious, this running back room isn't presenting much value. J.K. Dobbins will be, that solid starter, but you might have to wait 1 week into the starts when he gets going. Alan Lazard, he was listed as questionable, working his way back from that ankle injury. Believe we talked about that. He was stepped on. He played in that Packers-Bears game, but his first game back, only 3 targets, 2 receptions for 13 yards and a touchdown. And the touchdown that saved his day if you started him. So keep him for this week on your bench, as I don't keep him in general, and I don't think you have to start him. We just mentioned they're going up against the Bucs and their tough defense. And I don't project Sammy Watkins, who led the Packers with 3 receptions for 93 yards, to last the season as a top target or even to last being healthy. So keep Lazard. And if you have to start him, you have to, I mentioned this earlier. The Colts downgraded Michael Pittman midway through the week after a quad injury in practice. Early reports are suggesting he could return for week 3, so stay tuned into the practice reports this week from the Colts. Speaking of midweek injuries, Gabe Davis listed as questionable for Monday night versus the Titans with an ankle injury. He was added to the injury report Saturday, I believe. But the decision to bench Davis across the board, if you saw the report, paid off because he was inactive last night. Another injury to monitor the reports on from the Bills this week. Leonard Fournette, going back to the Bucs, he was listed as questionable with a hamstring injury for the Bucs. He played, and it didn't seem to be too much of a concern. So continue to roster Rachaad White as a top backup in the league for fantasy, but Leonard Fournette, good to go. We'll talk more about him in a little bit. T. Higgins in concussion protocol when I last left you. He played in the Bengals-Cowboys game this past weekend. Continue keeping him in your starting lineups. Jerry Jeudy left the game for the Broncos versus the Texans with an apparent shoulder injury, but it turned out to be a rib injury, so that's much better for fantasy managers. X-rays, they've come back negative, so at this point, questionable for the weekend, but I would expect good to go sooner than expected if it was a shoulder injury, obviously, from how he fell in that first quarter. So he's considered day-to-day was the update that we last heard. James Conner, he had himself an ankle injury. So this one, I'm unsure on the current status of. We just got a report, actually, so I'll give you a quick update in a second. But he left the game versus the Raiders, and the replacement work was split between Eno Benjamin and Darrell Williams. They're going to come up in the waiver wire section, but I believe there's definitely a potential waiver wire landmine here. So stay tuned to the end of the episode when we get into the waiver wire wizardry. As if Connor sits for the weekend or any extended period of time, and we talked about how injury prone James Conner is, I believe the guy to own is Darrell Williams, not Eno Benjamin, as the usage has suggested. We see this all the time in the NFL where the guy we think is the next man up, in this case, Eno Benjamin, he isn't actually the replacement because a player further down the depth chart is actually the true replacement in that role, and that would be Darrell Williams in this scenario. Dalton Schultz, he left the week 2 game against the Bengals with a knee injury. We had fears for the worst, but it turns out it was much better than we feared. Sounds like a PCL injury, maybe similar to Zeke last year. Have a backup plan for this weekend and potentially next for Schultz. And potentially next for Schultz, but the state of the tight end position and the level of this injury, you need to hold on to Schultz. Jerry Jones saying today that the knee injury could only keep Schultz sidelined for 1 week. Now, sorry, we said we were going to update on that James Conner injury. The ankle injury that kept Conner off the field is not considered long-term or serious. He remained in uniform and stood on the sidelines during the game, so that's great news. Stephen Jones, moving back to the Dallas Cowboys. He said it was certainly possible that Michael Gallup suits up for week 3 against the Bengals. This is notable because people are prioritizing Noah Brown on the waiver wires and feeling much better about CD. My advice would be to fade this receiving core and trade CD if you can. Maybe look at like Mike Evans, who could be the Mike Evans manager who would be bummed they're missing him for a week. The Pittman owner. Any of these top flight wide receivers that haven't done as well in these first 2 weeks. Joe Flacco, moving back to him, 100 plus passing attempts in the first 2 weeks, and great for that Jets offense for fantasy. He's starting week 3 against the Bengals, so start up them Jets receivers. Harrison Butker, the Chiefs kicker, Andy Reid said, quote, "We'll see how it goes this week." Butker recovering from that sprained ankle he sustained in week 1. Matt Amendola, his replacement, was perfect against the Chiefs, so I see no reason to rush Butker. And y'all, with Butker, need to have a backup plan at kicker in place. The last bit of news here that I want to cover, barring any breaking news, 49ers third-round rookie running back Tyrion Davis-Price has a high ankle sprain and will be sidelined a few weeks. This is typically a 4 to 6 week injury. So Jeff Wilson Jr. is the main man you can start now with confidence with the Garoppolo start. Tyrion Davis-Price gone. Elijah Mitchell on IR. Here we go. Let's go. So if you did end up grabbing Jeff Wilson, I know, we had our reasons against picking up Jeff Wilson, but the whole situation has changed. And that's the crazy thing for fantasy is the whole situation can change on this just one weekend. So With that being said, let's hop into your fantasy football outcomes of the week. We're talking road kills first.
Fantasy football outcomes, road kills.
So starting at the quarterback position, the low-hanging fruit here is Trey Lance, quarterback 33 with that season-ending ankle injury. So if you started him, such a disappointment, so much fantasy excitement, what could have been for Trey Lance. But let's move on to some guys that actually played for their entire games, or while it might not have seemed like it for the amount of fantasy points that they put up. Ryan Tannehill, quarterback 32. If you're paying attention there, Trey Lance, quarterback 33, Ryan Tannehill, quarterback 32. So I just got a big LOL in my notes. And of course, that was against the Bills defense. So, I mean, it seems like with this Bills defense, they're just so talented that you can kind of bench players going against them for the week and lower your expectations for your studs that will be going against them. But keep in mind that next week, those Buffalo Bills, they'll be looking to take down that Miami Dolphins offense. So risky pickup of Tua, but we're going to get to that. Matt Ryan, quarterback 31 with that barren wide receiver core we mentioned. So maybe one thing that we learned from this matchup is we just avoid the divisional matchups and really pay attention to this wide receiver core, because at his age, we need targets, and we should have known that. We really should, but that's okay. We're learning. We're going. This season is a new one. Tom Brady, same thing. Barren wide receiver core. He finished at quarterback 28. Now, Russell Wilson, Kirk Cousins, Jameis Winston, Justin Fields, quarterbacks 24 to 27. Russ, we are worried about. I'm close to being comfortable streaming quarterbacks above him, especially with a 49ers defense matchup for Russ next week. Cousins, I'm the least worried about. He's got a great matchup against the Lions next week. Spoiler alert, he might be my stream of the week in terms of the quarterback river. We've seen against the Lions, we've seen Wentz and Jalen Hurts both smash. So start up Kirk Cousins is a great start next week. Jameis Winston with that back injury and Kamara injury, don't start him. Don't start him. And Justin Fields, while he is the entire offense, he is a risky streamer at best. So keep him out of your lineups. In the category of we're disappointed, but like whatever in this quarterback room, Marcus Mariota at quarterback 18. If you streamed him, he played against that tough Rams defense. He still rushed 6 times, only for 16 yards. He threw for 2 touchdowns, had 2 interceptions. But that's kind of what you're looking at as Mariota's floor, I guess, against that tough defense. Until he plays the Bills, then we'll really see the floor. Aaron Rodgers at quarterback 17. Without Adams, he is showing not to be a top 12 start. Personally, I'd follow my dad's advice and move on. You can try to trade him, but like at this point, who's taking on Aaron Rodgers? Joe Burrow at quarterback 15. The amount of sacks that he's absorbing is concerning. The Jets next week, though, start him up. Maybe we'll give him this one last chance to kind of turn around before we start panicking in the streets and moving on to streaming. All right, to the running backs. The Baltimore running backs, Mike Davis at running back 79 and Kenyon Drake at running back 74. Same as last year, if there's no Dobbins or Gus Bus in this Baltimore running back room, do not use them, and you can drop Davis and Drake. Isaiah Pacheco with the Chiefs, it turns out he was only usable because of the blowout last week. You can drop him. Rex Burkhead, 0 carries. Coach Lovie Smith stayed true to his word. Dameon Pierce was prioritized with 15 carries for 69 yards. He did have 3 targets. That's Rex for 2 receptions, 9 yards. This Texans backfield has righted itself, really. Pierce only 1 target, but Dameon Pierce is this risky flex / very low running back too, and that's exactly where he finished at running back 24. Travis Etienne, here we go again. It's time to start treating this as a true rookie situation. I had more confidence coming into the season that with Trevor Lawrence and the relationship there and the explosiveness. And with James Robinson's Achilles injury, 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 equaled 4, but turns out that it still only equals 2. I mean, the math is regardless, but he may replace James Robinson in the snap percentage leader category eventually. And you love to see the involvement in the passing game. Like I mentioned, that silky smooth explosiveness on the field. But James Robinson now up at 63% of snaps and 23 carries this weekend. You got Etienne finishing at running back 36 on that flex borderline, and that's what you should consider him going forward. But again, you want more competitive matchups for Etienne in the passing game, and that's what we thought we were going to get out of the Colts. So something to keep in mind going forward. So in the category of very big concerns, sound the alarms, Rashad Penny, only 6 carries with the Seahawks with the return and to health and the debut of Kenneth Walker III. So here's the stat lines. You got Penny, 6 carries for 15 yards, 0 targets. Ken Walker, 4 carries for 10 yards, 3 targets. Travis Homer, 2 carries for 9 yards, 4 targets. Homer has led the Seahawks backfield with a 45% snap share this past weekend, and he's favored on passing down. So keep Penny and Walker on your benches. I think you're looking for an injury to one of these two again to vault them into, even flex category. And Travis Homer is just ruining the value of both of these. So, I mean, with the Seahawks, we're going to get to the wide receivers, but it might be an entire offense to avoid for fantasy. You got Devin Singletary running back 57, even in a blowout. You might have thought Devin Singletary might be out there in mop-up duty, but again, it makes sense that they want to have their rookie out there. But Devin, 6 carries for 19 yards, 4 targets, 2 receptions for 2 yards. You're going to want to keep him on your bench going forward. Maybe he's more usable in that Miami matchup. And we mentioned James Cook. He led the backfield because of the blowout. He had 11 carries for 53 yards, including a 33-yard rush. So it's a lot better than the stat line for James Cook. That is a lot better than the stat line than 1 carry for 2 yards and a fumble. Moving on to the Cowboys, you got Ezekiel Elliott not looking as explosive this week. And he's not going to be the one busting off like a 20+ yard rush. That's going to be Tony Pollard. He was running back 3 overall in PPR, 15 attempts for 53 yards, averaging 3.5 yards. That's Zeke, where Pollard is averaging 4.8 yards per carry, 2 targets to and Pollard 7 targets. Pollard also being used on the goal line now. So I think if you can trade Ezekiel Elliott, try to move up that running back totem pole with a trade. And lastly, in this very concerned category, Chase Edmonds, only 5 carries, 33 yards at 6.6 yards per carry. The yards per carry looks good. And it looks like the game plan here was for Mostert, where he had 11 carries for 51 yards. But keep in mind, Mostert is so injury prone. There's a lot of people dropping Chase Edmonds right now. Keep both of these running backs on your benches, but we're concerned. The ones that we're not really concerned about, Dalvin Cook as a fantasy football roadkill, running back 51. This Philly defense that he played against this past week with Minnesota is for real. Cook, 6 carries, 17 yards as Hurts got them to that massive lead again. 6 targets, 4 receptions for 19 yards for Cook. Also a trade target if you're looking to move a top running back that has disappointed or somebody that's flashed. If you could somehow get Zeke plus and turn it into Dalvin Cook, you need to do that. Not saying that's likely, just a great tip. James Conner, running back 39. He did have the ankle injury, so we're going to throw that one out. Jonathan Taylor, it's good to humble the Jonathan Taylor owners, but it doesn't feel great being one of them. We mentioned, that 4 or 5 carries for 5 yards at the half stat that they just kept repeating. The Colts, they know that he needs to be leaned on. Like they're getting too cute about this and like trying to save him for the playoffs, but they got to get there first. Kareem Hunt and AJ Dillon, they were a bit of roadkill this week. They had similar situations where the touchdowns just bounced to like Aaron Jones and Nick Chubb. We'll get to them in the fantasy football big thrills, but with Kareem and AJ, you're starting both of them in your lineups. Cam Akers, he was back involved, 15 carries to Darrell Henderson's 10. Akers 44 yards, still in that under 3 yards per carry range, but 3 targets to Henderson's 0. That resulted in 2 receptions for 18 yards. keep Cam Akers. And we mentioned Darrell Henderson. He was at running back 12 in PPR just because of the rushing TDs. So trade him away. Like in a crazy scenario, if you had Darrell Henderson and Zeke, which is possible from draft slot, where you were in fantasy football drafts, I mean, I doubt that as the Dalvin Cook owner, you would take that, but throw it Dalvin Cook's way. And another one to target, Derrick Henry. He's not looking too good after that, going up against that Bills defensive line in the blowout. So another top running back to target. Josh Jacobs, we got another loss for the Raiders. So you got another running back 2 week for Josh Jacobs. They were ahead at one point, and he did have 19 carries, 69 yards, a target and a reception for 12 yards. And this is what we're going to get. Running back 22 on the week, as I mentioned, and running back 2 weekly with running back 1 upside with touchdowns in victories. Joe Mixon, running back 21. Not awful, but he still had the 4 targets. I love seeing that and love seeing his baseline here. Leonard Fournette to finish off the running backs at running back 27. He said, don't worry, fantasy football managers, the TDs are coming. He had 24 attempts for 65 yards as he was the focus without the Bucs receivers against a tough Saints defense. Also, 2 receptions on 4 targets. Very, very good to see from Leonard Fournette. So I'm not worried about Fournette, Mixon, Jacobs, Henry. That Rams running back room, we're still kind of balancing itself. Kareem Hunt, AJ Dillon, James Conner, Jonathan Taylor, Dalvin Cook. Not really concerned about those, and good trade targets as well. All right, we're moving on to the wide receivers, where we had 0 burgers for, and that's 0 points for Paris Campbell, DJ Chark, Donovan Peoples-Jones, and then Darnell Mooney essentially at 0.6. All of those players are droppable, including also at 2 points for the week, Kadarius Toney. We hoped, but we're not getting what we expected out of this Giants receiving core under Dable. They're going to start their guys, is the report I believe I saw today. Another roadkill at the wide receiver position. Jerry Jeudy, he had that first quarter injury that led to him being wide receiver 99. So I'm not worried when he's back to full health and starting. Now, the entire Chiefs receiving core was a roadkill. I mean, aside from Kelsey, it could have been that tough Chargers defense, but only Marquez Valdes-Scantling had over 4 targets aside from Kelsey, and he turned his 7 targets into 2 receptions for 13 yards. Juju was 3 receptions for 10 yards at wide receiver 82. I don't want any of these. I don't even want the headache of considering whether to start them, drop them. Elijah Moore. I mean, okay, you can keep Juju on your bench if you really need to, but I don't even want to consider, because this was supposed to be the shootout of all shootouts, right? Like, that's the reasoning. Anyways, Elijah Moore, wide receiver 70. There's still going to be a lot of pass attempts for the Jets. He still had 5 targets. You still like him a lot better than Corey Davis. Keep Elijah Moore on your squads and potentially just on the bench, but we'll talk more about the matchups for the week as we get into them on the next podcast. DK Metcalf going up against a tough 49ers defense. He still had 6 targets, 4 receptions for 35 yards. And we're seeing, again, it's just going to be a lot of this baseline until we get a little bit of an explosion. Mike Evans, he got ejected for the fight. Avoid the next Saints matchup when that comes up, because in division, they're going to play them again. Lattimore gets his blood boiling and shuts him down. That was a tough week for him. Devontae Adams at wide receiver 52. He still had 7 targets, but that only turned into 2 receptions, 12 yards, a touchdown. So good to see the touchdown saving your week, but throw this one out for Devontae Adams. You're not going to ever bench Devontae Adams. Come on. Alan Lazard working his way back from that ankle injury at wide receiver 51. We talked about his stats. This offense for the receivers not looking good, but don't drop Lazard quite yet. Let's see how he looks one more week out past that ankle injury. Sterling Shepard, he's the receiver to own in New York with the Giants, 32% of the targets. Tough week being in this roadkills, but he's the one that you need to own. We're not worried about Brandon Cooks at wide receiver 49. He still had over 9 points. This will be the ups and the downs of the Texans. But, that was against the Denver solid defense. Still going to be a very reliable wide receiver for fantasy. Still had 10 targets. A good trade target he only ended up with those 4 receptions for 54 yards. But again, against Denver, that's pretty good. As a side note, Nico Collins, as the wide receiver 2 there, 9 targets, 4 receptions for 58 yards. So he should also be owned in your fantasy football leagues. Jamar Chase as the wide receiver 44. You can throw this one out too. 9 targets was still there. 5 receptions for 54 yards. And this brings me to the overall point as we, I'll get to the overall point in a second, but AJ Brown, wide receiver 39, you got Hurts with his legs. He's going to eliminate teams and shrink the passing pie at times. So you're looking at an up and down roller coaster for AJ Brown. And that's, if you could pair him with somebody more reliable or target somebody more reliable, Keenan Allen at like the top level of that. But guys like even Sterling Shepard, where the targets and the receptions are going to go up, that could be a guy to pair him with as he continues to recover from that Achilles injury. That's Sterling Shepard. Like I said, AJ Brown going to be up and down. If you can pair him with somebody more consistent, Brandon Cooks being the best acquirable example, do that. So that brings me to the overall point of the wide receivers. A big reminder here, wide receivers are inconsistent. This is very, very tough to remember with a small sample size. So do not panic on any of your top wide receivers quite yet. We're going to see how this all balances out. Let's see how 4 weeks goes. How's that sound? All right. At the tight end position, your roadkills of the week. Travis Kelce at tight end 13. He still had 5 receptions for 51 yards. You're still probably pretty happy with him, because we're going to get to all the other guys that were started and just did even worse. This whole Chiefs wide receiver core, as I mentioned, it's a headache, but good to see 7 targets, and tight end 13 as like the basement for Travis Kelce. Feeling all right with that. Dawson Knox, tight end 18, 5 targets. Good to see bounce back in the target realm. 4 receptions for 41 yards. Not the worst week, but you're still like all of these guys that I'm going to be talking about next. No touchdown, and that's exactly why they ended up here. TJ Hawkinson, tight end 24, 7 targets, 3 receptions, 26 yards. Loving the targets, not loving the no touchdowns. And can we get the reception percentage up a little bit? Hayden Hurst, tight end 21, again, 7 targets. Love to see the Hawkinson and Hurst 7 targets, but you're turning this into sub 30 yards, where Hurst with 5 receptions for 24 didn't kill you, but also didn't really help. Kyle Pitts, this is the big topic of the week. Tight end 28, 2 receptions again for 19 yards again. And quote from the coach, Arthur Smith, "I don't care about your fantasy football team. I'm trying to win." Well, here's the thing there, Arthur. If you're going to use your number 4 overall pick, your highest drafted tight end in NFL history, as a decoy to target Kadarrell Hodge or Olamide Zaccheaus or whatever hodgepodge of wide receivers that the Falcons are running out there behind Drake London, then you're doing it wrong. More targets for Kyle Pitts, and I am standing here. I'll proclaim it. I want to target Kyle Pitts in trade offers. I don't believe this is going to continue, but we are very, very frustrated and worried. Moving on to some lower level ones. Robert Tonyan at tight end 33. He was a recommended pickup for the week by myself. That led to 2 targets, 2 receptions for 11 yards. You can move on, and we'll talk about him later. OJ Howard at tight end 46. I called this one. 1 target this week, 1 reception for 7 yards. So don't go touchdown chasing. That's what we learned. We were chasing after the touchdowns with Tonyan, but that's because he's this touchdown magnet and he plays with Aaron Rodgers. OJ Howard on the Texans? Nah. Dalton Schultz at tight end 44. He had that PCL knee injury. He still got 4 targets, 2 receptions, and 18 yards while he was playing. So keep him on your lineups while he is injured, and it's looking like a short recovery time and a short while he'll be returned back to the lineup. Probably just missing 1, maybe 2 weeks. And then we get to the end here with Cole Kmet. We are sending him off in the boat into the sunset. We have not seen the targets. We have not seen a reception for Cole Kmet. You are free to drop him at this point, and we know this because, obviously of everything that I've mentioned, but it seems like this offense is just going to be Justin Fields running around and targeting whoever's open at the end of the day, and there's not like there's a prioritized target share for Mooney and Kmet anymore. Different coaching staff, and it's shocking because of the level of talent with Kmet and Mooney, but whatever. Let's move on to something positive.
Fantasy football outcomes. Big thrills.
Big thrills. All righty. So Lamar Jackson, quarterback one. You'd be pumped about a running back who went 9 carries for 119 yards and a touchdown. And you'd be pumped about a quarterback who went 318 yards with 3 passing touchdowns. Lamar was both of these for over 40 points. Let's go, Lamar. At quarterback 2, Tua Tagovailoa with over 460 passing yards, 6 passing touchdowns. Turns out that having the fastest receiving core in the NFL and an offensive guru head coach helps the quarterback. Who knew? Jalen Hurts at quarterback 3. Remember when y'all were laughing because he was at my quarterback 3 in the rankings? 2 weeks in, was looking pretty smart here. 6 points less than the top 2 who were over those 40 points, but no slouch himself at 34 points. At quarterback 3, like I mentioned, 330 yards passing, 1 passing touchdown, and 11 carries for 57 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. That's all my shares of Jalen Hurts. Just At quarterback 4, this should be no surprise either. Josh Allen, right around that 30 points mark. Ho-hum, just another day at the office for Josh Allen with over 300 yards, 4 passing touchdowns, and he only needed to rush once because they just absolutely buried the Texans at halftime. In your surprising big thrills category, Carson Wentz at quarterback 5, Odog's quarterback stream of the week recommendation. We're going to pause here, filibuster a little bit while Owen brings up the dance party because we need to have a stream of the week dance party. And you know what? If you started either Lamar Jackson, Tua Tagovailoa, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Carson Wentz, feel free to join in this dance party because here we go. Lamar Jackson, over 40 points. Tua Tagovailoa, over 40 points himself. Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen, 30 points. And if you were streaming, you followed that Odog quarterback stream recommendation down the quarterback river. Carson Wentz at quarterback 5 with around 28 points. You're going to want to stay tuned for this week's recommendation. Here we go, Nation. Woo! Joe Flacco at quarterback 6. You're not going to use him for fantasy, I don't think, but kind of a low-key juicy matchup with the Bengals this week, who let Cooper Rush get the quarterback 20 finish. So, I mean, I don't think Joe Flacco could do worse, and you could do a lot worse in your lineup. So if you're really desperate, Joe Flacco could do it. Others in the top 12 that were expected, Jared Goff in that shootout with Wentz, Kyler Murray, Justin Herbert, Derek Carr, all solid options. And the last 2 in the top 12 not mentioned, Stafford, he bounced back against the Falcons as I suggested he would. And then Trevor Lawrence had himself a very solid day against the Colts. All right, moving to the running back position. I have a note here. If I neglected to mention it, I'm switching to discussing these rankings in terms of PPR scoring as it's the default across NFL, ESPN, and Yahoo. So if you didn't catch that, that's exactly what we've been doing for those wide receivers and running backs. It doesn't really affect the quarterbacks as much, but that's how we're looking at the scoring for these positions going forward. So this was a rough weekend for the running backs. Per Fantasy Pros in this PPR setting, only Nick Chubb and Aaron Jones were the ones above 20 points, and they're your big thrills of the week. Nick Chubb, running back 1, the Browns continue to lean on both him and Chubb, both him and Kareem Hunt. Those TDs, they went from Kareem Hunt, who was running back 27 on the week, back to Chubb. So this tells the story for the year of these running backs without Deshaun Watson, and then to a degree, potentially with him. Stay tuned for how we're going to view them when we get to week 12 or 13, I guess it would be. There's a bye week in there when Deshaun Watson actually starts. Aaron Jones, 30 plus points himself, 15 rushes for 132 yards and a touchdown, paired with 3 targets, 3 receptions, 38 yards, and a touchdown in the air. This is the Aaron Jones life, up and down based on the usage and the touchdowns combining in that backfield with A.J. Dillon. David Montgomery at running back 10. He and Justin Fields are this offense. Justin Fields is averaging 14 passing attempts per game. So Montgomery and Fields, they are and were and will be leaned on. Montgomery, 15 rushes, 122 yards. You saw it get going where, they're down in the game. You expect them to start passing, and let's run the ball more with David Montgomery. Questionable coaching decisions, but for fantasy, hell yeah, let's go. Solid running back 2 and a trade target in David Montgomery. Less thrills and more just, thank you for finishing in the top 12 running backs as expected. These guys as follows. Austin Eckler bounced back as running back 4 in the Thursday night game, 14 carries for 39 yards, but 10 targets, 9 receptions for 55 yards. This is one that I'm struggling with. I would be considering looking to trade him off this performance. We haven't seen the usage on the goal line that we saw last year, and the extra targets that were there are likely from Keenan Allen's absence. However, the 14 carries for 39 yards, not a good yards per carry by any means, but again, going against this difficult Chargers defense. If you are looking to trade Austin Eckler based on these factors that I've listed, maybe consider targeting the down game from Jonathan Taylor if possible. Christian McCaffrey, that might be a lateral move, or maybe, DeAndre Swift. I gotta love DeAndre Swift. So let's get to those two. Christian McCaffrey, running back 5, had more usage on the ground, 15 carries for 102 yards, 5 targets, 4 receptions for 26 yards. He isn't the entire offense with Baker there this year, but still solidly a running back 1 or 2, as I mentioned. DeAndre Swift, running back 6, only 5 carries, dealing with that ankle injury that we mentioned. Or I don't know if we mentioned it, but he popped up on the injury report with an ankle injury. He said, don't worry. And then came out and only got 5 carries, but 56 yards on those carries, and did have 5 targets, 2 receptions, 31 yards and a touchdown. So, if this is the floor for Swift at running back 6, that's a big season in store. And we always knew that these injuries, they are a big risk for Swift. Clyde Edwards-Helaire out of Kansas City in the Thursday nighter, 8 carries for 74 yards. Wow, look at that yards per carry. 4 targets, 4 receptions for 44 yards. Keep in mind that he had 74 yards on the ground, and about 52 of them came from a long carry. So you take out the long carry, that's 22 yards on 7 carries. This is another trade high candidate. And Clyde, as I mentioned, I always have him on my teams, and I don't this year. If you do, you should be looking to trade him and move up. Package him with somebody else and go get one of the big boys that you like. The big thrills that you may not have started, big thrills with an asterisk, because these were all below 17 points in PPR scoring, but Damian Harris, running back 6, tied with Swift for running back 6. He bounced back with 15 carries for 71 yards and a touchdown, 2 targets, 2 receptions for 16 yards. This is essentially what you're going to expect from him on the Patriots. It's that solid, not spectacular, and he finished in the running back 1 range on the week due to the low running back scoring across the board. James Robinson at running back 8, 23 carries for 64 yards. And like Clyde, let's consider taking out this 37-yard touchdown where he did look explosive, okay? Let's first off give him the due credit where credit is due. Give him credit where credit is due. He did look extremely explosive and fast on that touchdown run. That's a great sign coming back from that Achilles injury. But if you take that out, this becomes 21 carries for 27 yards. Not great, Bob. But again, those snaps, that snap percentage for Robinson is coming up. He added 2 receptions for 14 yards. That's great. 23 carries is great. So you're feeling good about James Robinson. Just wanted to put a little bit of context in there. Another candidate to trade high on. We're feeling good about Najee Harris finishing at running back 12, but not feeling good about Najee Harris season long, or at least Trubisky season long. 15 attempts, 49 yards, 6 targets. Okay, that came back. 5 receptions for 40 yards, 0 touchdowns for Najee. So we're asking, please, no more Mitchell Trubisky. And definitely a ceiling on Najee as this Pittsburgh team progresses with Trubisky. Running back 16, Antonio Gibson, 14 attempts for 28 yards, 2 yards per carry. Not great, but still a touchdown and 4 targets. We're seeing a bit of the floor with Antonio Gibson, but with those 7 receptions last week, that was super encouraging. They just went back to the wide receivers this week. Saquon Barkley, running back 17, fell from that running back 1 slot. 21 attempts for 72 yards, still looking good. 4 targets for 3 receptions and 16 yards. Still looking good. You're not panicking at all. Good week for Saquon. Miles Sanders at running back 18. He looked explosive yet again. 17 attempts for 80 yards, 3 targets, 3 receptions for 6 yards. Boston Scott and Kenny Gainwell still involved. 6 carries, 3 targets. Jalen Hurts with 11 rushes. So Miles Sanders, with how explosive this offense is, you're probably looking at a pretty consistent running back too. Joe Mixon, running back 19 attempts for 57 yards, 4 targets, 3 receptions for 54 yards. The Bengals didn't look as great this week, but still loving seeing the 4 targets for Joe Mixon. Breece Hall, he is passing Michael Carter. Both had 7 carries, so maybe not a big thrill, but Breece had 50 yards at 7.1 yards per carry. There's the big thrill. And Carter only had 23 yards for 3.3 yards per carry. Breece only had 1 target, coming back down to earth from those 10 targets, where Carter had 5. But Breece Hall, his 1 target was 1 reception that turned into a touchdown to finish as the running back 10 on the week. I think that you can start Breece Hall going forward next week as a running back 2 weekly option. All right, let's move on to the wide receivers. And we're going to have another dance party because we had 4 wide receivers. Okay, we'll call it 4 because one of them was at 39 point something, all with around or over 40 points in PPR scoring formats. Let's have ourselves a dance party. Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, wide receiver 2 and 3. Stephon Diggs, wide receiver 1, coming in hot on Monday night. And then that leaves at wide receiver 4, the 3rd player in NFL history to record 8+ catches in 8 straight games, joining Michael Thomas and Antonio Brown. Can I get a whoop whoop for Amon-Ra St. Brown, everyone? So if you didn't catch that, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 on the week. As I mentioned, they would have been the wide receiver 1 and 2 on the week on the same team, both with 11 targets, over 170 yards each, 2 touchdowns. Start confidently with target consolidation. We saw a ceiling that we didn't know was there. Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver 4, the 3rd player in NFL history, as I mentioned, to record 8+ catches in 8 straight games. Michael Thomas, Antonio Brown, the others in that category, a chance to break the record next week. He had 9 receptions on 12 targets for 116 yards and 2 TDs, and he added 2 rushes for 68 yards. This should continue. And I mentioned that we were concerned about the return of their first round wide receiver, Jameson Williams. But at this point, fantasy is a weekly and a quarterly thing. So you can definitely consider Amon-Ra St. Brown very, very set at that wide receiver 1 level. It just might be something that we start talking about as we start hearing reports of Jameson Williams getting a little closer to his return. Stephon Diggs, your wide receiver 1 of the week from that second last game. 12 receptions on 14 targets without Gabe Davis in the lineup. 3 touchdowns. Let's go, Stephon Diggs. Looking like a solid draft pick that you could have taken late in the first round. Then we get to Cooper Kupp, wide receiver 5 after the big 4 of the week. Still, locked in for a wide receiver 1 week every week from Cooper Kupp, always open. And then we get to wide receiver 6, Garrett Wilson. This marks the start of the rookies that I want to talk about today. Garrett Wilson, wide receiver 6. I mentioned that he flashed last week, and Joe Flacco clearly noticed. 14 targets, 8 receptions, 102 yards, 2 touchdowns. You need to believe in Garrett Wilson. Corey Davis, 4 targets. Elijah Moore, 5 targets respectively. Garrett Wilson is the wide receiver 1 on this offense, and they will be coming from behind a lot. Drake London at wide receiver 10, 12 targets for 8 receptions, 86 yards, 1 touchdown. Pitt still sitting at that 3 targets, 2 receptions for 19 yards. Like I mentioned, start Drake London with confidence. And then we get to Chris Olave, wide receiver 42, not the lowest number you're looking for, but we saw the massive target volume for Jarvis last week. And we said, Olave and Michael Thomas, their takeover is coming. And coming against And then going against this tough Bucs defense, Landry faded back to 5 targets, 4 receptions for 25 yards, and Olave 13 targets, 5 receptions for 80 yards. The breakout is on. You can start him confidently as a wide receiver 2 going forward, albeit with with a little bit of an asterisk too. Kamara was out and Jameis is playing with fractures in his back. So that's why we got him around that wide receiver 2 / a flex option. Michael Thomas himself, 9 targets, 6 receptions for 65 yards and a touchdown, looking like that tight end or that touchdown threat in this offense. And then we get to Christian Kirk, baby. You know me, I'm a low-key, for fantasy, Jags fan. Top 24 receiver for 2 weeks in a row. Last week, the wide receiver 19. This week, up to wide receiver 7, where he currently sits at wide receiver 7 overall for the 2 weeks. Love the target volume. Gotta love seeing 2 touchdowns this week. Consider Kirk a borderline wide receiver 1 in this pass-happy offense. And I don't think he'd be a guy that I would be trading away. Mike Williams averages about this level of production that he did get with Keenan Allen out, but we are feeling a lot better. Wide receiver 8 on the week, 10 targets, 8 receptions for 113 yards and 1 touchdown. We have corrected back with Mike Williams. And speaking of corrections, Amari Cooper, he finished at wide receiver 9, 10 targets, 9 receptions, 101 yards and 1 touchdown. This may be the status quo, but it also could be a headache of the Browns receiving core. So you had Donovan Peoples-Jones. He had 11 targets last week, and I don't have the numbers down here, but over 100 yards. And now he didn't even have a reception this week. So it could be just flip-flopping. It could be the correction back to Amari Cooper, but I would believe more in Amari Cooper. So you need to have him on your rosters, and Donovan Peoples-Jones, you can keep him for 1 more week and then drop. If he still isn't as involved as he was. The Commanders passing attack. This could have been just, playing against that Lions defense, but through 2 weeks, it looks like this is one of the wide receiver cores to really pay attention to. And it looks like Curtis Samuel is the man. Wide receiver 12, Curtis Samuel, 9 targets, 7 receptions for 78 yards and a touchdown, and 1 carry for 21 yards. Again, we're seeing that carry. That's establishing a safe baseline, and 9 targets, feeling very confident there. McLaurin bounced back. He got 8 targets, 4 receptions for 75 yards. So we're not panicking on McLaurin at all. And Jahan Dotson, he was the one that got the touchdown where McLaurin didn't. 5 targets, 4 receptions for 59 yards. So lower level of targets, same amount of receptions, lower level of yards, but did have that touchdown that led to Jahan Dotson being wide receiver 20. Rashad Bateman caught another long touchdown bomb. Devin Duvernay did flash with the opening kickoff. That was awesome. But like I said, Bateman is the wide receiver 1 here. He had 7 targets to Duvernay's 2. That was 4 receptions, 108 yards, and a touchdown. You got a boom bust receiver, wide receiver 2 in Bateman going forward, and wide receiver 13 on the week. So good for Rashad Bateman. Noah Brown at wide receiver 14, and then CeeDee Lamb also on the Cowboys. And if you didn't know where Noah Brown was from, that's the wide receiver 2 currently of the Cowboys, but we'll get to why we wouldn't prioritize Noah Brown in a second. Noah Brown, 5 targets, 5 receptions for 91 yards and a touchdown. CeeDee Lamb, 11 targets, 7 receptions for 75 yards with Cooper Rush. So I mentioned I wouldn't prioritize Noah Brown, but it's at least an interesting pickup with Cooper Rush. Maybe there's some chemistry there, but remember the return of Michael Gallup is looming. It potentially comes this week. definitely next week. He wasn't placed on the PUP, so you got to be expecting him this week or next week at the latest, because the pup would have costed him 4 games, and then he would have been back week 5. And this is week 3 and 4. So logic says they expect him at least this week or next, unless he's had a setback, and we haven't heard that. And with Stephen Jones saying that he was at least expecting him for this week, again, this is where we start marking some downgrades to that Cowboy receiving core with Cooper Rush. Tyler Lockett, back from the dead, wide receiver 15. I still wouldn't be betting on him weekly with Geno, but Coach Pete Carroll, they said he wants to unleash the passing attack, which is really funny because, you got Geno. But 11 targets for Tyler Lockett. DK Metcalf only had 6 targets. Lockett finished with 9 receptions on those 11 targets for 107 yards. Cortland Sutton is a wide receiver 1. He was more necessary with that Jerry Jeudy injury, but he's still the go-to. 11 targets, 7 receptions for 122 yards to finish as the wide receiver 15. A great snag if you're able to get him late in your NFL fantasy drafts, and maybe a little earlier in the other drafts, as the ADP for Sutton across platforms was different in draft season, that is. Also finishing in the top 24, wide receiver 17, T. Higgins. Keep starting him as a wide receiver 2. Good to see that he was good to go after that concussion. Michael Thomas, we mentioned tight end or touchdown. I did that twice. Touchdown threat, slowly getting up to speed again. And then we get to Nelson Aguilar and Jacoby Myers. Nelson Aguilar, wide receiver 11, and Jacoby Myers, wide receiver 18. We said not to bet on the Patriots wide receivers, and then they go out and do this. Feels personal. I'm sure they don't care. Nelson Aguilar, 6 targets, 6 receptions for 110 yards and 1 touchdown. This is the one that I wouldn't be betting on, because Jacoby Myers, 13 targets to Aguilar 6, 9 receptions for 95 yards, more consistent. But again, Aguilar is that deep threat. So if you are desperate in a week and you need somebody to bet on to kind of just be in your flex and maybe get finished with this wide receiver 11 finish and take your team over the top, consider Aguilar if you have both options. But Jacoby Myers is the top wide receiver in this offense. We got the Ravens next week too. So with seeing how these Ravens have looked in their secondary, consider Jacoby Myers a solid wide receiver 2 start. Allen Robinson at wide receiver 23. We predicted this bounce back when Sean McVay mentioned that. And you got Kupp at wide receiver 5, Higbee succeeding too. We're going to talk about him in a second. So it's good to see that all 3 can exist. 5 targets, 4 receptions for 53 yards for Robinson and a touchdown. That's exactly what I would imagine you'd be looking at going forward. He's not going to be this massive volume guy, in my opinion, but he will be a touchdown threat, and he will have 4 to 6 receptions per week. Corey Davis at wide receiver 21. We mentioned the long broken touchdown earlier as Joe Flacco and the Jets came back. He's still the 3rd priority of these Jets wide receivers after Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, who I still believe in, because Corey Davis, 4 targets, only 2 receptions for 83 yards. You remove that 66-yard touchdown and you have 1 reception for, quick math here, 17 yards. Don't prioritize Corey Davis. Greg Dortch, wide receiver 22. That's wide receiver of the Arizona Cardinals, if you didn't know. You don't need to chase him. Was the 3rd option behind Marquise Brown with 11 targets and Zach Ertz, but Marquise Brown himself, 6 receptions, 68 yards. We're seeing their usage for Marquise come up as he gets used to this offense, and Dortch himself was 4 receptions for 55 yards, but had the touchdown, and that's really what vaulted him into the wide receiver 22, or into the wide receiver 2 range to finish at wide receiver 22. All right, let's finish off the big thrills at the tight end position. We've got Mark Andrews. If you were worried about him after week 1, you do not need to, and I'm sure you weren't, because that's where you drafted him, in that round 1/2 range. But again, you still want to see these explosion weeks. 11 targets, 9 receptions, 102 yards, and 1 touchdown. Great for Mark Andrews. And then Darren Waller, tight end 2, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 50 yards, 1 touchdown. Oh, another day for Darren Waller. Zach Ertz, tight end 3. So again, Andrews, Waller, Ertz, and Kelsey, these are your top 4, and these are the guys that you want to target. And Ertz himself, tight end 3, 11 targets, 8 receptions, 75 yards as he bounced back from that injury. And then we kind of get into everything else. Another guy that I think you can feel very confident in, Dallas Goedert, tight end 7, 5 targets, 5 receptions, 82 yards. Definitely going to be the highest level of receiving yards that we talk about out of this next group, and just, needed that touchdown. And again, with these tight ends, you just need to see touchdowns, because everybody on this list except for Goddard, Higbee, and Evan Ingram and Zach Ertz, they all had a touchdown, and that's what made them into where they finished. So we mentioned Higbee and Everett. These are the next guys that I would be considering. Higbee over Everett, because Everett more flashing, in my opinion, with the injury to Keenan Allen, but we'll have to see how his usage is when Keenan is back and fully healthy. Gerald Everett, 10 targets in that Thursday night game, 6 receptions for 71 yards, very high in the yardage mark and the targets. And same with Tyler Higbee, tight end 5, 9 targets, 7 receptions for 71 yards. Feeling good about the top 6 or 7 here. Then we get into the bottom level. Irv Smith, not bottom level for this week, with a tight end 4. He bounced back with 8 targets, 5 receptions for 36 yards and 1 touchdown. I don't know if this is one you want to get chasing. They mentioned that it wasn't a game plan for Irv last week, but this week, watching this game, there were a couple of really ugly drops. So consider him a risky pickup if you're trying to bounce back and grab him again after dropping him previously. Mike Gesicki, we're going to get into why I wouldn't pick him up, but 4 targets, 4 receptions, 41 yards, and a touchdown. He was part of the game plan this week. Logan Thomas, tight end 9, 5 targets, 3 receptions, 37 yards, and a touchdown. Pat Freiermuth, again, 7 targets. Loving to see that. 4 receptions, 22 yards, and a touchdown. Pat Freiermuth would join those top-level tight ends: Kelsey, Andrews, Waller, Ertz, Higbee, Freiermuth, Gerald Everett. Those are the guys that you're looking at. And then all of these guys, other guys, are kind of just hoping for a touchdown, and we're looking at the targets to guide us. Finishing off the top 12, Evan Ingram at tight end 11, 8 targets, led the receiving corps in targets, 7 receptions for 46 yards. Great pickup. And then Ross Dwelly on the 49ers. This is exactly what you need to get into the top 12 tight ends. 1 reception, 38 yards, 1 touchdown. You can ignore Ross Dwelly, but does show good signs for Kittle as he comes back and gets more targets from the new starting quarterback, and again, starting quarterback, Jimmy Garoppolo of the 49ers. All right, let's talk about who you're going to add this week.
Waiver Wire Wizardry.
All right, let's rustle y'all up some magic here in the Wizardry section for the waiver wire, starting with the quarterbacks. If you lost Trey Lance, or you've lost confidence in Aaron Rodgers, or you've lost Dak Prescott and you try to replace him elsewhere, you want to consider, and again, the percentages of availability is of NFL.com fantasy, Tua Tagovailoa. You might think that he might be your top option with that massive explosion. He's 33% available in NFL.com fantasy. He's likely a starter on NFL fantasy for the rest of the year. It's going to be up and down, but he does have that baseline with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, but he does have the Bills next week. Let's turn our attention to some guys I'd rather add. Carson Wentz, we just talked about him, 58% available. We had another Wentz game, lots of yards, lots of touchdowns, another interception, and a fumble that became a safety, but lots more weapons this year on the Commanders. And we've got the Eagles next week. So not the best matchup that I'd be looking for, but definitely a lot better than the Bills. And then we move on to who I would advise picking up, because I think you should be pivoting to streaming, because if you're considering Tua and Carson, you're considering a roller coaster. So at that point, I would consider streaming. And keep listening to the Want to Know Fantasy Football podcast. On the Wednesday show, we have our quarterback streamers of the week in the quarterback river segment. And the last 2 have been quarterback 5 or 6, I believe. So we'll get an update on that going forward. And then, the most likely one for the week is going to be Jared Goff, as he goes against the Vikings, who people have been putting up top 10 quarterback numbers against. He's 95% available. He got four passing touchdowns this week. Let's go, Jared Goff. And then as a last resort option, if you aren't able to, if Tua's owned in your league where he's only 33% available across NFL.com, and Carson Wentz only 58% available, and Jared Goff is one of the pickups by your opponents, you're looking at Jimmy Garoppolo, 98% available, lots of weapons, but unfortunately has the Broncos next week. So we're looking at these quarterbacks at a weekly level. Let's move on to some players that we aren't looking at for a weekly level. So the running backs, here's your priority. I'm pivoting over from giving percentages, but here's the priority level. And then you can look at your league and other sources to find out, if you're in a fab league, how to prioritize that. But the number one priority for the week, James Robinson, still available in 12% of NFL.com fantasy leagues. Jeff Wilson still at 58% availability, and that might have been because, you got Trey Lance in there. Most people thinking similar to how I did with Trey Lance with a lot of rushing attempts, but Trey Lance is gone. Jeff Wilson had a great week. Definitely looking at him as a solid running back to start as we keep moving forward here. Tony Pollard is somewhere at my third priority, still somehow 12% available. Scoop him up if he's there. Raheem Mostert, 66% availability. Definitely an injury risk, but 11 carries leading that Dolphins backfield. Looking good. Darrell Williams, he might be the big pickup of the week, but we need more information on James Conner. So do yourself a favor, do a quick little googly search, look for the latest news on James Conner, and Darrell Williams would be the one that I would prioritize from the options there. I'm going to mention you want to avoid Eno Benjamin. He is kind of that pass catcher role there. And next week, we've got the Cardinals going up against the Rams. That's a tough defense. So that's why I'm at least prioritizing the other four above him. But you can still sink a pretty large bid into Darrell Williams, especially if you see a multi-week absence from James Conner. J.D. McKissic, 86% availability. We saw some more usage in the passing game. I believe there was around 7 targets for that Commander's offense, and that might be where the targets from Antonio Gibson went as well. So just looking at it now, J.D. McKissic, 7 targets, 7 receptions for 54 yards. Saw a little bounce back as they didn't prioritize him in the passing game as much in week 1. So a prioritized pickup there. 6th on my list. 7th on my list, Mark Ingram, 93% available. We don't know if we're going to see another week out from Alvin Kamara, much to my high ownership level for Alvin Kamara. But last week against that very, very difficult Buccaneers defense, Mark Ingram was still able at his age to rattle out 10 rushes for 60 yards. So next week we've got the Saints going up against the Panthers, who are also a semi-difficult defense, but you're still looking at him as at Mark Ingram, that is, as maybe a flex level start if Alvin Kamara is injured. We mentioned avoid Eno Benjamin. Now, to make room for these guys, who can you drop? Well, Rex Burkhead, Isaiah Pacheco, Dontrell Hilliard, and the Ravens running backs, if you have them. Do not drop Rashad Penny unless you have to. I would drop Rashad Penny for James Robinson, Jeff Wilson, Tony Pollard, those top 3 options, but not Mostert, Darrell Williams, or J.D. McKissic. Travis Etienne, do not drop. Chase Edmonds, do not drop. And Melvin Gordon, do not drop. Moving to the wide receivers, the big pickup of the week. This is where it is. Garrett Wilson, 74% available in NFL.com leagues. Use your priority on Garrett Wilson. He is the number 1 receiver of those Jets who are going to be playing from behind and going to get a lot of targets. Which, surprising me in my evaluations of this waiver wire, Christian Kirk I put at 2nd priority. He is only available in 11% of leagues, which is still shocking, the fact that he's available in 11% of leagues. But Garrett Wilson, Christian Kirk, and then now Drake London at 14% available. These guys need to be your top 3. And then again, I think included in this tier, Curtis Samuel as that number 1 wide receiver for the Commanders, 28% available. If Wilson, Kirk, London, or Samuel are available on your waiver wire, go get them. Moving into some lower options, Jacoby Myers, 80% available. Like I mentioned, leading that New England receiving core in terms of targets. He's the one you want to target over Nelson Aguilar, who I have in my avoid category here. Jahan Dotson still available. The wide receiver of the Commanders, 74% available. Back-to-back weeks with a touchdown. Chris Olave, we mentioned, the switchover in that wide receiver core is on. B2 for Chris Olave and Michael Thomas taking over. 39% available across NFL.com fantasy leagues. And then look for the return of Michael Gallup coming soon. 80% available across NFL.com leagues. Not a prioritized pickup over these guys just because of the Cooper Rush factor, but, should hop right into that Noah Brown role that we saw last week. The last addition of the wide receiver core of the wide receivers for the week, Treylon Burks at 54% available. We're starting to see him take over that wide receiver one role of the Titans. Now, for the wide receivers, avoid Noah Brown, Jamison Crowder, Corey Davis, Greg Dortch, Nelson Aguilar, and Sammy Watkins. These guys are all being heavily added in NFL.com leagues. You can drop Darnell Mooney with the Bears. Robbie Anderson of the Panthers, Jarvis Landry of the Saints, everyone in the Chiefs receiving core except for Juju if you really want to keep him. Kadarius Toney of the Giants, George Pickens of the Steelers, DJ Chark of the Lions, Devin Duvernay of the Ravens, Kyle Phillips of the Titans, and Donovan Peoples-Jones of the Browns. Do not drop Robert Woods. I mentioned that Treylon Burks is kind of leading that receiving core, but Robert Woods did flash back to kind of where we expected him to be with the more reliable target in that Titans offense. Juju Smith-Schuster, I mentioned him. Adam Thielen, Hunter Renfrow, Elijah Moore, Alan Lazard, all do not drops in my opinion. Now, let's move on to what you've all been waiting for, the tight ends. So if Pat Freiermuth, Gerald Everett, or Tyler Higbee in that order are available, those should be your prioritized pickups of the week. Freiermuth, 13% available. Everett, 21% available. Tyler Higbee, 19% available. So very unlikely that they're there, but check. Logan Thomas would be my next priority at 77% available. Looks like a touchdown threat with Washington, and the targets have been there. Tyler Conklin with the Jets. I told you so here. Lots of targets. I believe there was 9 targets for Conklin with the Jets this week from the Flacco offense. 96% available. And Conklin and Irv Smith, I would be recommending kind of in tandem. You can pick one between the two, but Irv Smith saw a lot more involvement in the offense this week. Conklin more steady, so I would put him above at 5th. Irv Smith at 6th. And then I can't fault you if you want to go Evan Ingram above. He was prioritized and had higher levels of targets than most of these guys in that Jaguars offense that's very pass heavy. I got him at 7th here. And then Hayden Hurst at 96% available at 8 if you miss out on all these guys. You want to avoid Mike Gesicki. I don't like that he can be completely game planned out and that he does a lot of inline blocking. We talked about that last week. And then your drops at the tight end position. You're looking at Cole Kmet, Taysom Hill, Albert Okwuegbunam, Hunter Henry, OJ Howard, Robert Tonyan, and David Njoku. And then do not drop Dalton Schultz, TJ Hawkinson, Dawson Knox, and Kyle Pitts. At the defense position, you are looking this week. Good starts include the Steelers versus Cleveland, the Cowboys versus the Giants, the Saints versus the Panthers, the Browns versus Pittsburgh, the Bengals versus the Jets, the Chiefs versus Indy, especially if Pittman is out. So let's talk about some order of these in the percentages just to close out the show here. So for your ads, your number one priority should be the Steelers defense versus Cleveland if they're available. That's 25% available across NFL.com fantasy. The Eagles versus Washington would be my next priority. After that, 86% available. They're likely your big pickup of the week at defense. The Cowboys versus the Giants, probably your number 2 pickup of the week, but they're more heavily owned at 33%. The Saints versus Carolina at 43% is my 4th priority. The Bucks versus Green Bay, 7% available at my 5th priority. The Chiefs versus Indianapolis at 31% owned as my 6th. Ravens versus the Patriots at 75% owned as my 7th. And then to end off the show and end off my defensive pickups for the week, the Houston Texans flashing a little bit more on defense. They're going up against the Chicago Bears next week. They are 99% available. So if you miss out on all these defenses, scoop out the Texans. All right, y'all. Thanks for staying with me as I took the time took the time to get back to nature, get a little bit more centered in myself, and come back a better fantasy football analyst for you as I went back into camping in the backcountry. So I really appreciate that. Keep providing feedback on these solo shows. It's always very, 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 very much appreciated. And we'll see you tomorrow/Thursday to preview the Thursday night matchup, half of the matchups, go down the quarterback river for a quarterback stream of the week. And yeah, Odog out. Have a good one.
Okay, everybody, we're done here for today. You're gonna want to listen to the next episode of the official 1-0 Fantasy Football Podcast. Odog out.